For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history fan community, visit patreon.com/World of Antiquity. We're going to talk about the stars today. Specifically, I want to see if we can ascertain the age of the zodiac. How far back does it go? We'll walk through the evidence and then look at some claims made about it that challenge the views of mainstream scholarship, including in an episode of Ancient Aliens. There are bound to be some things here you didn't know, so stick around. Myths of Ancient History is aimed at dispelling common misconceptions about the past. If you're interested in ancient history, lost civilizations, and secrets from antiquity, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, because you will get plenty of that kind of material. And if you find this particular video valuable, please hit the like button and comment below with your favorite takeaway. And feel free to ask any clarification questions that you may have. If we're going to be technical about it, I'm really going to be talking about the origins of the constellations that make up the zodiac, rather than just the zodiac itself. That's because the constellations came first, and the zodiac came second. So, where do we begin? The 12 constellations of the zodiac are among a larger group of 48 constellations that we inherited from the ancient Romans. You might say, wait a minute, the constellations have been around since before humans even existed. Don't you mean we just inherited the names of the constellations from the Romans? Well, yeah, but the forms of the constellations too, and the images that went with them. Yes, they are natural phenomena, but a constellation, being a group of stars that remind us of something we're familiar with, is a subjective construct. Who says which stars are supposed to be viewed together? Humans do. Now yes, some groupings of stars, because they are in close proximity and might create a shape that piques our interest, are more likely to get called a constellation. But exactly how many stars make up a constellation, and what someone decides that constellation looks like, whether an animal or a person or whatever, is all in their own minds. It's like people looking at clouds and seeing different objects. The Chinese, for example, looking at pretty much the same sky, came up with a different set of constellations and identified them as different entities. The Maya probably had their own set of constellations as well, although at this point we still don't know exactly what they were. Granted, because certain groups of stars attract attention, there's bound to be some similarity among various cultures as to what they see as a constellation. And it's entirely possible for two people in different parts of the world to look up at the same constellation and think of the same animal, if they both know of the animal, even though they never had any contact whatsoever. So tracing origins can be tricky. When we try to ascertain continuity and influence, we have to look for specific and unique characteristics in sufficient quantity. Now, as for the 48 constellations we got from the Romans in turn got them from the Greeks. Ptolemy of Alexandria in the 2nd century CE wrote the influential star catalog Mathematicae Syntachis, also known as the Almagest, which presented the 48 constellations in their final form. There were other catalogs that preceded his, though. Hipparchus, perhaps the greatest Greek astronomer of them all, since he's the one who discovered precession. I'll get to that later. Who lived in the 2nd century BCE, and before him Aratos of Soli and Eudoxus of Cnidus were sources for Ptolemy. But the Greek map of the sky wasn't original. It probably was based on two different earlier systems. One came from Babylon, we know this, and the other came most likely from Mediterranean sailors who used it for navigation. The Minoans of Crete are a likely candidate for the source of that system. Now for our purposes, since we're discussing the constellations of the zodiac, we're going to look at the Babylonian system because Babylon is where the Greeks got it from. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in the 4th century BCE, the Greeks began to familiarize themselves with Babylonian astronomy and astrology. One type of text that the Greeks found in Babylon were astrometric diaries, which are books of precise measurement of planetary positions. The positions of the planets were recorded in degrees, minutes, and seconds of arc, relative to the position of the 12 signs of the zodiac and some other related stars. Alexander's successors, who were very interested in astrology, incorporated the zodiac into their own system, and that is how it entered the Greek world. Although the zodiac itself is Babylonian, the word zodiac is Greek. It means a circle of animals. Eudoxus, in his book, wrote about how the Babylonians used the zodiac for horoscopes. His book no longer exists, but we have ancient writers tell us what was in it. Many of the Babylonian astrometric diaries, which Eudoxus consulted, do still exist, you may be happy to know, dating between 650 and 60 BCE. But the zodiac didn't become part of them until around 420 BCE. Scholars believe that's because the zodiac wasn't invented until just before that time. I don't mean the constellations that happen to make up the zodiac. They had a much longer history. I mean the organization of the system of the zodiac into 12 equal signs used for astrological purposes. You see, because the Babylonians were doing astronomy for centuries by then, and the zodiac is never mentioned in any of their prior documents, even though the individual constellations are, it's reasonable to assume that the zodiac was a later invention. So, around 500 BCE, the Babylonians invented 12 signs to correspond to 12 known constellations that the sun passes through in each of the 12 months of the year. Let's go back further in time. An important surviving document from Babylon is the Mulapin, an astronomical compendium, of which many copies were made, and we have pieces of a bunch of them. Our oldest copy is from 687 BCE, but the astronomical observations in it appear to date to around 1000 BCE, and we determine that from the positions of the heavenly bodies in the descriptions. So much earlier than the astrometric diaries I was just talking about. No zodiac is in the Mulapin, but it has a complete catalog of 71 stars, planets, and constellations. The constellations are numerous, and yes, the ones that would later become part of the zodiac are in it. All 12 of them. They're not grouped together, just mixed in with a bunch of others, but they're there. There are a handful of other non-zodiacal constellations that the Greeks later picked up in there too. As for the symbols that represent the constellations in the Mulapin, some of them already have their classical form. Cancer is a crab. Leo is a lion. Taurus is a bull. Libra is a pair of scales. Scorpius is a scorpion. Gemini is the twins. In this case, Lugalgira and Mesalamta-Ea. Aquarius is the Mesopotamian god Ea, who is associated with water. Virgo is the goddess Shala, though not a virgin. And Sagittarius is a god named Pabilsag, who is sometimes depicted as part man, part horse. On the other hand, Aries is a shepherd or farmer, not a ram. Capricornus, instead of being a goat, is a hybrid goat-fish. And Pisces is not a fish, but a swallow. It would seem then that the Greeks changed Aries into a ram, Capricornus into a goat, and Pisces into a fish. Why did they do that? Well, perhaps because of the other non-Babylonian traditions they'd received. Going further back in time in Babylon, we come to the 3 stars each lists. These are tablets that date to around 1100 BCE, and there are a number of them. Only some of the constellations of the zodiac appear on these lists, and that's as far back as we can go with Mesopotamian astronomical texts. But contemporary with these lists, and going back even a little further to 1350 BCE or so, are the Kuduru, or boundary stones, which have curses on them that were written to protect the land on which they were placed. Although they are not astronomical texts, they do contain symbols on them which may represent constellations. The symbols they contain include Taurus, Leo, Scorpius, Sagittarius, Capricornus, Aquarius, and probably Virgo and Aries. Forerunners to Gemini and Pisces may be on them too, but Libra and Cancer are nowhere to be found, even though we have more than 100 of these boundary stones. Of the 12 constellations that would later make up the zodiac, Libra and Cancer are probably late inventions. Cancer's stars are rather faint, so it doesn't really stand out in the night sky. Libra is described in Babylonian texts as the claws of Scorpius, which indicate that originally it was not a separate constellation, but simply part of Scorpius. Then after it was separated from Scorpius, at some time before the 3 stars each lists, it became the Scales. But it took some time for that to catch on because it was sometimes called the Claws and sometimes the Scales. It wasn't until the time of Julius Caesar that the Scales completely superseded the Claws. Nevertheless, many scholars believe that the symbols on the kuduru simply represent gods and that there's insufficient justification to assume that they're constellations. Yes, we know gods were often used as symbols of constellations in the time of the astronomical texts, but we simply don't know whether they did earlier. These symbols may just simply refer to gods, and that's it. Currently, there's no way of knowing. Moving backwards in time from here, we get to the Sumerian period. In the surviving texts, no constellations are named, and there in fact is no indication the Sumerians even had constellations. But as with the kuduru, there is imagery that has been interpreted as such. Bulls and lions appear often in Sumerian imagery, especially on cylinder seals, where they're often placed in the sky or with stars. These could be the constellations of Taurus and Leo. Less frequently, but still there, is the sign of the scorpion, probably Scorpius. It just so happens that in the Sumerian period, these 3 constellations, plus Aquarius, marked the 4 cardinal points of the ecliptic. The ecliptic, in case you don't know, is the circular path that the sun makes in a year, and the 4 cardinal points are set 90 degrees apart on it. The fact that these 4 constellations were major ones and never varied in their symbology throughout Mesopotamian history, and were important in their positions in the Sumerian period, suggests that they could be the oldest of the constellations that would later comprise the zodiac, and were created around 3200 BCE, give or take. We're already treading on unstable ground, but there are researchers who have suggested that some of the constellations have their origins even further back in history. What is the basis for these claims? We'll look at these claims momentarily, but first, a necessary evil. This is a community-supported channel. If you're enjoying the kind of information I've been presenting in this video, and in others like it, there are a few ways you can support the channel to help keep it alive and keep the videos coming. The very best way is by becoming a patron over on Patreon for just $2 per month. You can find that at patreon.com/World of Antiquity. If you want to help the channel out without directly donating money, you can do it indirectly, simply by watching every video all the way through without skipping the ads. That way, instead of you having to send me money, the advertisers do. Either way, I very much appreciate your support. Now, as for the claims that the constellations of the zodiac might be even older, what do we have? Well, one piece of evidence is art found on the walls of Paleolithic caves in Europe, long before the Sumerians. These have been studied and have indicated to some researchers that certain images are of constellations. Julien Dupuy, for example, has used phylogenetics to support the idea that the myth of the cosmic hunt associated with the Big Dipper goes back that far. In his book Before Orion, Bernie Taylor examines El Castillo Cave in Spain and makes a case that several of the constellations that would later become part of the Greek catalog appear there on the walls. But most of these are non-zodiacal constellations. Now, I must say that because the images on the walls here are not entirely clear and depend somewhat on the imagination of the viewer, I don't know if we can objectively demonstrate what is being depicted. But if we could, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that some of the constellations represented at El Castillo made their way through the generations to the Mediterranean and then into Minoan culture, and from there into Greek culture. That's feasible, I would say. But are there any links to the star maps of Babylon? This is Taylor's outline of the constellations in the Gallery of Discs in the El Castillo Cave. There are a few that match or sort of match what we see in Babylon. And remember, the image or symbol has to match in order for us to posit a link, because these constellations can be seen in many places, and if they're called something different and associated with a different symbol, then it's likely that we're looking at an independent tradition. Now, from the zodiac, Leo the lion is a match. You might be able to make the case that Pisces is a match, A dolphin or a whale here matches the fish, but since the original image for Pisces in Babylon appears to have been a swallow and only a fish later on, there's reason to doubt a direct link. As I mentioned before, Leo is among the zodiacal constellations that probably have the earliest origins, even though it was most likely during the Sumerian period that it, along with Aquarius, Taurus, and Scorpius, marked the 4 cardinal points of the ecliptic and were thus associated. That doesn't mean all 4 of those constellation symbols were invented then. Is it possible that the tradition of calling the Leo constellation a lion goes back to Paleolithic times? I think it's possible. But how did it get to Mesopotamia? That I couldn't tell you. Now, there have been some other less convincing claims about the age of the zodiac. You can hear about some fairly outlandish theories in an episode of Ancient Aliens called The Constellation Code. Let's take a look at them, and I'll tell you why I don't think they hold up.
Somerset, England, 1927. 49-year-old artist Catherine Maltwood has been commissioned to draw a map outlining the adventures of the knights of King Arthur. Thanks to the recent invention of the airplane, she is able to obtain the earliest aerial photographs of the area. While studying them, she suddenly notices a figure in the landscape.
She noticed what appeared to be a landscape lion. It just sort of reared up at her, quite literally. And she examined this and wondered whether this was the Leo figure of the zodiac. Then she saw next to it this large, giant figure, which she felt was part of some kind of collective of landscape effigies that had been laid down by ancient hands. And one by one, she found that they actually represented the 12 signs of the zodiac.
Glastonbury Zodiac is so large that you can only really see it from the sky. These zodiac signs are marked by rivers, streams, roads, field boundaries. Pisces is actually 2 fishes, and one of the fishes is Wiriel Hill. The other side of the road, we have Aries. They were actually creating certain parts of the zodiac as earthworks, as shapes, deliberately.
The shapes look so much like man-made features that Maltwood published a book about them and called it The Temple of the Stars.
So here we have some ideas that go back to the 1930s, but certainly not in scientific or archaeological circles. Catherine Maltwood's ideas about the Glastonbury Zodiac, which she believed was created by the Sumerians. Yeah, apparently the Sumerians were in Glastonbury. And which she connected to the Holy Grail in Arthurian legend, and her astrological beliefs, didn't actually achieve much of any attention until 1969, when an article by Mary Kane in the magazine Gandalf's Garden popularized it. Mary Kane made alterations to Maltwood's scheme, changing the outlines of Capricorn, Libra, and Leo, turning Scorpius upside down, and adding the image of a monk to Gemini. Then from there, it made its way into ancient astronaut suppositions, which rejected Maltwood's Sumerian dating and pushed the Glastonbury Zodiac back into the early Stone Age. There are 3 main weaknesses in the Glastonbury Zodiac hypothesis. The first is one that you may be thinking of already, and which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Just as anyone can look up into the sky at a group of stars and note how they resemble a shape meaningful to the onlooker, so the same can be done with lines and dots seen in an aerial view of a landscape. Anyone can see patterns in random objects. In fact, it's a human propensity. And the shapes that are seen depend on the cultural expectations of the viewer. Hey, look at that! It's SpongeBob. And here's Patrick. And Mr. Krabs. I'm sure you see my point. It's a Rorschach test. Images extracted in this way do not exist objectively, but merely in the minds of those who see them. Second, the shapes do not in fact match all that well with the signs of the zodiac. In the zodiac, Cancer is not a ship, Libra is not a dove, and Aquarius is not a phoenix. The third weakness in the hypothesis is fatal. Catherine Maltwood used modern features in the landscape to establish the details of her images, including roads, drainage ditches, and paths that can be demonstrated not to have existed before early modern times. She even used signs of agricultural activity in her own time, including a haystack, which she saw as the Eye of Capricornus. Paths dating back to Neolithic times do exist here, but none of them were used in Maltwood's outlines of the constellations.
While it was received with much skepticism, proponents say there is ample evidence around the region to suggest these formations have been created by artificial means, and that almost every field and hill in the area has been modified in some way.
One of the most important ones is called Ponta's Ball. Now, this is a large, mile-long, pointed earthwork, which is exactly where the Capricorn effigy's horn is in the zodiac.
Ponta's Ball is a linear earthwork about 15 feet high that was built either as a territorial boundary or as a dike when this was swampland. Some archaeologists have dated it to the 3rd century BCE. Others have proposed a medieval date in the 12th century. I've seen no evidence presented to suggest it comes from the Stone Age. What we have here is an attempt to date the entire zodiac by appealing to the presumed antiquity of a tiny portion of the whole. Since it's already been established that Maltwood's zodiac effigies incorporate elements from many different time periods, a Stone Age horn for Capricornus, even if definitively demonstrated, would do nothing to unify the date for the creation of all the signs.
Even more significant is a massive hill called Glastonbury Tor. Many researchers are convinced that this is a man-made feature. And based on its shape, some have even suggested it could be hiding an ancient pyramid.
Glastonbury Tor is the most significant part of the whole Somerset landscape. On top of it, we have St. Michael's Tower, a 14th century construction. But the main site itself has terraces carved around it like a labyrinth coming up from ground level all the way to the top.
If there really is a labyrinthine design marked out on the slopes of Glastonbury Tor, it's not just pre-Roman, it must be pre-Celtic. It must even date back to the megalithic times.
I don't follow the logic of the statement that if there are the remains of a labyrinth on the Tor, then it must be pre-Celtic, much less from megalithic times. There is no archaeological period called megalithic times. I think the argument is based on the idea that the terraces on the hill seem to form a labyrinthine design similar to what is often called the classical labyrinth design, which has been seen in other places. Whether these designs are linked in some way would be a topic for another video, but the fact is, we don't know whether the design on Glastonbury Tor matches any of the others because weathering, trampling, and shifting of the soil has made it unclear what the original design was. And since the other instances of this labyrinth design are from many different time periods, that means it can appear whenever. And so that would leave the time of the making of the labyrinth on the Tor up in the air. The summit and shoulder of Glastonbury Tor was, in fact, excavated between 1964 and 1966. Most of the remains were from medieval times. There was no evidence of structures from Roman or prehistoric times. But they did find some remains of Roman and Samian, that's Greek, pottery. The only items from prehistoric times were flints and a greenstone axe. Certainly nothing suggesting high technology. Could there be something underneath it that hasn't yet been discovered? Sure, it's possible. But that possibility doesn't eliminate the flaws in Maltwood's claims about the zodiac being enshrined in the landscape.
Alatri, Italy, June 2019. Ancient astronaut theorist Giorgio Tsoukalos is in the heart of the Italian peninsula, about 50 miles southeast of Rome. He is here to investigate the astronomical alignment of the finest megalithic construction in Italy, the city's Acropolis.
All right. Giulio.
Hello, Giorgio. How are you?
Good to see you again.
Yeah,
How
nice
are you?
to see you again.
What a fantastic place.
Welcome to the Alatri Acropolis,
I
Italy.
cannot wait to see all of this.
Yeah.
I've been waiting for years to see this. Amazing.
For expert insight, he has enlisted the help of Dr. Giulio Magli, a professor of archaeoastronomy from the Polytechnic University in Milan, Italy. The imposing megalithic citadel was built on top of a hill and is defined by 6 huge walls. The shape of the Acropolis, when viewed from the sky, has led some to suggest that it was built to create a lasting commemoration of the site's connection to the stars.
All right, so what do we see here?
Yes, you see, the Acropolis has a very regular shape. It is a polygon very similar to the polygons of the walls.
Okay.
And this very regular shape has nothing to do with the morphology of the hill, because, you know, a hill can be random.
Right.
But they wanted it exactly as it is.
So are you saying that this mount here was cut artificially?
Yes.
That is incredible.
So why? They wanted such a strange shape. There is a theory, which might be sound, that they wanted the Acropolis to have the shape of a constellation. And the edges of the Acropolis correspond to the brightest stars of the constellation Gemini.
So we are looking at the outline of Gemini here.
It may well be.
Wow.
May well be.
What's really interesting here is that the entire mountaintop has been artificially shaped so that it is in the shape of the constellation of Gemini. And then you have to wonder, why was it built in this shape? Because something of significance happened here a long time ago. What is your speculation how old this place really could be?
Okay, standard archaeology claims that this was made by the Romans. But Romans' techniques were, of course, very good, but based on horizontal planes and relatively small stones. So it is very difficult to believe that this was made by the Romans. It must be older.
I went and found Magli's full article on the dating of the Alatri Acropolis, and what Ancient Aliens does not tell you is that Magli dates the Acropolis to between the 8th and 4th centuries BCE. That's only a few hundred years earlier, not 10,000. So while he indeed believes it was not constructed by the Romans, he doesn't date it to the Stone Age or attribute the structure to a lost advanced civilization in the way that Ancient Aliens want you to believe he does. Disappointingly, although the episode is 42 minutes long, the Glastonbury Zodiac and the Alatri Acropolis are the only 2 pieces of physical evidence provided for the supposed prehistoric origin of the Zodiac. The rest of the episode just assumes its prehistoric origin and then builds upon that assumption. It's fair to say that approaching this subject, or any subject, with certain deficiencies in knowledge about one or more aspects of that subject, it's going to leave a person at a disadvantage. And when it comes to something like astronomy and astrology in ancient times and in prehistoric times, expertise in just one area, archaeology for example, isn't going to cut it. Interdisciplinary collaboration ought to be the rule of thumb. Bringing archaeologists or anthropologists together with astronomers or archaeoastronomers and comparative religion scholars, even wildlife biologists and depth psychologists, is going to make for much more informed and comprehensive studies of this subject matter. So what are your thoughts? Do you know of any other evidences, perhaps stronger ones, that the Zodiac goes back to times earlier than the Sumerians? Let me know in the comments below. Our discussion, however, is not over. I want to look at a claim having to do with the Zodiac and Göbekli Tepe. A physicist from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland has made some grand claims about images that were found on stone pillars at this Stone Age site. Is there evidence of the Zodiac there? That will be the subject of the next video in the series. If you don't want to miss it, don't forget to subscribe and ding the bell so you get notified. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Your support is much appreciated.